March 7, 1979. The Georgia State Capitol building in Atlanta. 400 people are crammed into the House of Representatives chamber, squeezed between wooden desks and pressed against marble walls. Legislators in their suit, their wives in their Sunday best, children fidgeting in their seat, and in the center of it all, a grand piano that took 6 men to wedge between the podium and the front row. A man in a purple suit approaches the piano. He moves slowly, deliberately, his hand brushing against the shoulders of seated congressmen as he navigates the narrow path. His dark glasses catch the light from the chandeliers above. His name is Ray Charles Robinson, and he is about to sing a song for the people who once tried to destroy him. He sits down at the piano. The room falls silent. 400 people hold their breath, and then his fingers touch the keys, and that voice, that unmistakable voice that has sold millions of records and broken millions of hearts, fills the chamber. Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through, but something is wrong. His voice cracks, his shoulders begin to shake. The legislators look at each other, uncertain. Is he okay? Should someone help him? Just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. Ray Charles is crying, not the polite tears of a performer moved by the moment. These are the tears of a man who has carried a weight for 18 years and is finally setting it down. The tears of a blind boy from Albany who was told he would never amount to anything. The tears of a black man who was once told that his money was good enough for Georgia, but his presence was not. The legislators begin to stand. One by one, then all at once. Democrats and Republicans, men who had voted for segregation and men who had fought against it. They are all standing now, applauding, some of them crying too. When Ray Charles finishes the song, he whispers something to himself. The microphones don't catch it, but those closest to him would later say he said just 2 words. Thank you, Mama. To understand why Ray Charles wept that day in the Georgia State Capitol, you need to understand where he came from. You need to understand what he survived. And you need to understand what happened on a March night 18 years earlier, when a blind man looked into the darkness and saw more clearly than anyone around him. Ray Charles Robinson was born on September 23, 1930, in Albany, Georgia. If you know anything about Georgia in 1930, you know that being born black and poor there was about as close to being born cursed as you could get. The Great Depression was just beginning. Jim Crow laws were at their peak, and for a black child in the Deep South, the future was a narrow hallway with most of the doors already locked. Ray's mother, Aretha, was just 15 years old when she gave birth to him. His father, Bailey Robinson, was a railroad man who drifted in and out of their lives like a ghost. Ray would later describe his childhood home in Greenville, Florida, where the family eventually settled, with brutal honesty. Even compared to other blacks in Greenville, we were at the bottom of the ladder. There was nothing between us and the dirt. But poverty wasn't the worst thing that happened to young Ray Charles. The worst thing happened when he was 5 years old, on an ordinary afternoon that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Ray and his younger brother George were playing in the backyard. Their mother had a large metal washtub filled with soapy water, the kind she used to wash clothes for the white families in town. George was 4 years old, curious and fearless in the way that 4-year-olds are. He climbed up on the edge of the tub to look at his reflection in the water, and then he slipped. Ray heard the splash. He turned and saw his brother's legs kicking above the surface, his small body weighted down by wet clothes. Ray ran to the tub and grabbed his brother's arms. He pulled with everything he had. But George was too heavy, the water too deep, and Ray was just a little boy. He ran inside screaming for his mother. "Mama, Mama!" George fell in the water. By the time Aretha reached the backyard, it was too late. George was gone. Ray Charles never fully recovered from watching his brother drown. He blamed himself. If only he had been stronger. If only he had pulled harder. If only he had run faster. That guilt would follow him like a shadow for the next 7 decades. But fate wasn't finished with Ray Charles. Not by a long shot. Within months of George's death, Ray began to notice that things looked different. Colors seemed muted. Shapes blurred at the edges. He started bumping into furniture, missing steps on the porch. His mother took him to every doctor they could afford, which wasn't many. The diagnosis was glaucoma, a disease that builds pressure inside the eye until the optic nerve is destroyed. There was nothing anyone could do. By the time Ray was 7 years old, the world had gone completely dark. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine losing your brother. Then imagine losing your sight. Imagine being 7 years old, poor, black, and blind in the Jim Crow South. Most people would have given up. Most people would have accepted that life had dealt them an impossible hand. But Ray Charles had something that no amount of tragedy could take from him. He had his mother. Aretha Robinson refused to let her son use his blindness as an excuse. She made him continue to do his chores, to fetch water from the well, to bring in firewood. When he fell, she made him get up. When he cried, she wiped his tears and told him to try again. "You're blind," she would say. "You ain't dumb. You lost your sight, not your mind." Those words became Ray's compass. They would guide him through every obstacle he would face, every door that slammed in his face, every person who told him he couldn't. He couldn't see, but he could think. He couldn't see, but he could feel. And most importantly, he could hear. Music had always been a part of Ray's life. When he was 3 years old, he would sneak into a local cafe called the Red Wing and watch a man named Wiley Pittman play boogie-woogie piano. Mr. Pittman noticed the boy watching and invited him to sit beside him on the piano bench. He showed Ray how to find the keys, how to feel the rhythm, how to let the music flow through his fingers. After Ray went blind, music became his salvation. His mother found a school that would accept him, the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind in St. Augustine. It was 160 miles from home, and Ray would only see his mother during holidays. But at that school, he learned to read music in Braille. He learned to play piano, clarinet, and saxophone. He learned that blindness didn't have to be a prison. It could be a doorway. Ray was 15 years old, still at the school in St. Augustine, when his world shattered for the second time. A telegram arrived with news that would send him into the only breakdown he would ever have. His mother was dead. Aretha Robinson was only 32 years old. She had never been a healthy woman, walking with a cane since her 20s, but to Ray, she had seemed invincible. She was the woman who taught him to survive. She was his compass, his anchor, his reason for fighting. 4 days, Ray couldn't speak. He couldn't eat. He couldn't think. The darkness that had taken his eyes now seemed to swallow him whole. People who knew him during this time said they were certain he would never recover. But somewhere in that darkness, Ray heard his mother's voice. "You're blind," she said. "You ain't dumb. You lost your sight, not your mind." Ray Charles Robinson picked himself up. He wiped his tears. And he decided that he was going to honor his mother's memory by becoming everything she believed he could be. The next decade was a blur of crowded buses, smoky nightclubs, and one-night stands in cities across America. Ray started in Florida, moved to Seattle, then Los Angeles. He copied the styles of Nat King Cole and Charles Brown until he found his own voice. He experimented with combining gospel music and blues, a combination that many churches considered blasphemous. He didn't care. He was searching for something true, something that felt like his soul bleeding through his fingers. In 1952, Ray signed with Atlantic Records. By 1954, he had released I Got a Woman, a song that combined sacred and secular music in a way that had never been done before. The song went to #1 on the R&B charts and signaled the birth of a new genre, soul music. Hit after hit followed. Hallelujah, I Love Her So, Drown in My Own Tears, What Did I Say? By 1960, Ray Charles was one of the biggest names in American music. He had moved to ABC Paramount Records for an unprecedented contract that gave him complete artistic control over his music. He was rich, he was famous, and he was still, in the eyes of Georgia law, a second-class citizen. That's when Ray Charles recorded Georgia on My Mind. The song was originally written in 1930 by Hoagy Carmichael and Stuart Gorrell. It was a nostalgic ballad about a girl named Georgia, or maybe about the state. Nobody was quite sure. Plenty of artists had recorded it before. But when Ray Charles sat down at the piano and let his voice wrap around those words, something magical happened. Georgia, Georgia. The whole day through, in Ray's mouth, the song became something different. It became a lament for a home that had rejected him, a love letter to a place that didn't love him back, a cry for a state that had given him life and then spent the next 30 years trying to make that life impossible. The recording was released in late 1960 and quickly became one of Ray's biggest hits. It reached #1 on the pop charts and won 2 Grammy Awards. Radio stations across the country played it constantly. White audiences who had never thought much about Georgia suddenly felt nostalgic for it, and black audiences who knew exactly what Ray was singing about felt something deeper, something that brought tears to their eyes. By early 1961, Ray Charles was at the peak of his fame. He had a band, the Realettes, as backup singers, and a tour schedule that crisscrossed the country. In March of that year, he was booked to perform at the Bell Auditorium in Augusta, Georgia. It should have been a triumphant homecoming, the native son returning to his state to perform his signature song in front of an adoring crowd. The concert was sold out. People had driven from across Georgia to see the genius of soul in person. But there was a problem. The Bell Auditorium was segregated. The main dance floor, where people could get closest to the stage, was reserved for white patrons only. Black ticket holders, the same people who had made Georgia on My Mind a hit, who had supported Ray Charles from the very beginning, would be forced to sit in the balcony. They could hear Ray Charles, but they couldn't dance to his music. They could applaud, but they had to do it from a distance. Ray didn't know about the segregation policy when he accepted the booking. His management had handled the details, and nobody had thought to mention that the venue would be separating audiences by the color of their skin. He found out on March 15, 1961, when a telegram arrived at his hotel room. The telegram was from students at Payne College, a historically black college in Augusta. They had heard about the segregated seating and were outraged. How could Ray Charles, of all people, perform for a crowd that treated black people as inferior? How could he accept their money while accepting their humiliation? "We are asking you not to play tonight," the telegram read. "We are asking you to stand with us." Ray Charles held that telegram in his hands for a long time. He couldn't see the words, but someone had read them to him, and they echoed in his mind like a bell. He thought about his mother, working as a washerwoman for white families just to keep food on the table. He thought about his childhood in Greenville, where he wasn't allowed to drink from certain fountains or sit in certain sections of the bus. He thought about all the indignities he had swallowed over the years, all the times he had smiled when he wanted to scream, all the doors that had been closed in his face because of the color of his skin. And then he thought about the dance floor at the Bell Auditorium, the floor where white people could dance while black people watched from above, the floor that said, in language more eloquent than any telegram, that some people's joy mattered more than others. Ray Charles made his decision. He wasn't going to play. The promoter was furious. "Do you understand what you're doing?" he shouted. "You signed a contract. You're going to be sued." Ray Charles didn't flinch. "Sue me then. I'm not playing for a segregated audience. But think about your career. Think about the money." Ray's response would become legendary. "I'd rather lose the money than lose my self-respect." That evening, while 2,000 people waited inside the Bell Auditorium, Ray Charles and his band drove out of Augusta. He released a statement to the press. "I feel that it is the least that I can do to stand behind my principles and help the students in their fight for their principles." The reaction was immediate and explosive. The promoter filed a lawsuit for breach of contract. The case went to the Fulton County Superior Court in Atlanta, where a judge ruled against Ray Charles and ordered him to pay $757 in damages. It was a slap in the face, a legal declaration that a black man's principles were worth less than a white promoter's profits. But something else was happening too. News of Ray's stand spread across the country. Black newspapers celebrated him as a hero. Civil rights leaders praised his courage. Students who had been afraid to speak up suddenly found their voices. If Ray Charles could sacrifice his money for what was right, they could sacrifice their comfort. The Bell Auditorium remained segregated for another year. But in 1962, under increasing pressure, the venue finally opened opened its doors to all patrons regardless of race. And on October 23, 1963, Ray Charles returned to the Bell Auditorium. This time, black people and white people danced together on the same floor. Ray Charles didn't make a speech that night. He didn't need to. He just sat down at his piano and played. And when he sang Georgia on My Mind, the entire audience, every color, every background, sang along with him. But the story doesn't end there. It couldn't end there, because the universe has a way of completing circles that we think will never close. For the next 16 years, Ray Charles continued to tour, to record, to push the boundaries of what music could be. He collaborated with country artists and jazz musicians and rock and rollers. He struggled with a heroin addiction that almost destroyed him and came out the other side clean. He fathered 12 children by 7 different women and loved them all in his complicated way. And through it all, he never stopped singing Georgia on My Mind. He performed it at every concert, thousands of times over the decade. Each time, he poured a little more of himself into those words. Each time, he thought about the state that had given him so much pain and so much music. Then, in 1979, something remarkable happened. The Georgia State Legislature decided to adopt an official state song. Several candidates were proposed, including an old tune simply called Georgia. But one legislator made a different suggestion. What about Georgia on My Mind? What about Ray Charles's version? The proposal was controversial. This was still the Deep South. Many of the legislators had grown up with segregation. Some of them had probably been in that Bell Auditorium in 1961, waiting for a concert that never happened. Were they really going to name a black man's song as their official anthem? But times had changed. The Civil Rights Act had passed. Segregation was officially illegal, and there was no denying that Ray Charles had created the definitive version of Georgia on My Mind. His recording had done more to promote the state than any tourism campaign ever could. On March 7, 1979, the Georgia General Assembly officially adopted Georgia on My Mind as the state song, and they invited Ray Charles to perform it in the state capitol. Think about that for a moment. The same state that had fined him for refusing to play a segregated concert was now asking him to sing for their highest governing body. The same state that had told him his people had to sit in the balcony was now giving him the main floor. Ray Charles could have said no. He could have reminded them of what they had done, of the lawsuit, of the $757, of the humiliation. He could have thrown their invitation back in their faces. But that wasn't who Ray Charles was. He had learned from his mother that bitterness was a poison that killed the person who drank it. He had learned from all those years on the road that the only way to change hearts was through music. And he had learned from that night in Augusta that standing up for what was right sometimes meant standing alone. So he put on his purple suit. He walked into the Georgia State Capitol. He sat down at that grand piano wedged between the desks of the General Assembly, and he sang, Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through. The legislators stood and applauded. They cheered and whistled. Some of them wiped tears from their eyes. They had no idea that the man at the piano was crying too. Just an old sweet song keeps Georgia on my mind. When the song ended, Ray Charles sat at the piano for a long moment. The applause washed over him like a wave, and somewhere in his mind, he was 5 years old again, watching his brother slip beneath the water. He was 7 years old, watching the world go dark. He was 15 years old, learning that his mother was dead. He was 30 years old, walking out of the Bell Auditorium while 2,000 people waited inside. He had carried all of that weight for so long, the guilt, the anger, the determination, the pain, and now, finally, he could set some of it down. Later, Ray Charles would write about that moment in his autobiography, Brother Ray. That touched my heart, he said. I cried. 2 simple words that contained a lifetime of struggle. 2 words that said everything about what it meant to be black in America, to fight for respect, to refuse to be broken, and to live long enough to see the world change. Ray Charles continued performing until 2003, when failing health finally forced him off the road. He died on June 10, 2004, at the age of 73. The cause was complications from liver disease, but those those who knew him said he had simply done what he came to do. He had changed the world through his music. He had stood up for what was right when it cost him everything, and he had lived to see his home state embrace him as a native son. Today, if you drive through Georgia, you might see license plates with the words "Georgia on my mind" printed on them. If you visit the state capitol in Atlanta, you can see photographs of Ray Charles performing in that chamber in 1979. And if you travel to Albany, his birthplace, you can visit Ray Charles Plaza, where a bronze statue of the genius sits eternally at his piano. But the real monument to Ray Charles isn't made of bronze or printed on license plates. The real monument is in the hearts of everyone who heard his music and understood what it meant. The real monument is in every person who refuses to accept injustice, who stands up when it would be easier to sit down, who walks out when it would be more profitable to stay. Ray Charles couldn't see the world, but he saw something that most people miss. He saw that dignity is more important than money. He saw that principles are more important than comfort. And he saw that sometimes the only way to change a place is to love it so much that you refuse to let it stay broken. Georgia, Georgia, a song of you comes as sweet and clear as moonlight through the pines. Ray Charles is gone now, but his song remains. And every time someone sings it, every time those notes float through the Georgia air, a blind boy from Albany opens his eyes and sees, if only for a moment, a world worth fighting for. That's the true story of Ray Charles and the night he turned his back on Georgia. Not to abandon it, but to save it. And in the end, Georgia reached out its hand and welcomed him home. Rest in peace, Brother Ray. Your mother would be proud.